Okay. Do you think? Yeah, I think it's good. Hi. Is it Jambus next song? È discolo, non è ma c'è questa è stato nel solito una pente. C'è stata sì, non è ordinato. E se la il consiglio tagliano un po' di bene. Sono guardati un po'. Ne, ci mettiamo Utilizzo, cioè ulle sì, ridosi se alle polizie.
That's a sport that is can't do it. Serious sports. Maybe there was this other success there.
Apply to Symposium.
Ma Giovanni,
Io lascio una Symposium.
e la vera shower, le serve della paese. Gente di ora, attenzione.
So I would like first to thank Siva for hosting me tonight, and I would like to welcome you all to my talk titled Stones That Whisper, Dervishes and Women's Rituals in Limassol. A large part of this research began around an abandoned mid-18th century funeral garden, a walled cemetery in Limassol, in the southwest grounds of Jami Kebir, the town's main mosque, contains 3 marble turbaned tombstones bearing ornate calligraphic Persian-Arabic verses. Once a lush garden, the cemetery has become a hollow leftover space vanishing from the city's identity. Around it are open-air bars and crumbling historic buildings belonging to former Turkish Cypriot residents and to the Efgas. And here we see Yusuf Agha bin Haji Omer's Konak ruins on Jadid Street opposite the cemetery. And we can see him sitting down in a picture of around 1885, the municipal council, and he's sitting next to Mayor Demosthenes Haji Pavlou. He was vice mayor. Yes?
I didn't introduce you.
Oh, didn't you? Oh, I didn't introduce myself either. Well, you can come in and I can pick up if you want.
Some more people are coming.
All right. Oh, I thought.
It's all right.
Shall I carry on? You can introduce me at the end. Yeah. Didn't think of that. Anyway. Right. So despite their neglect, both the cemetery and the mosque are under Minister of Interior guardianship after 1974. Following population exchanges and displacements resulted in the cemetery's abandonment. For the past 2 years, the mosque has been left temporarily gutted as a result of stalled repair works, while no plans appear to exist for the cemetery itself. This is not, I repeat, not a historic antiquity site because it's Turkish Cypriot cemetery. So some reasons of its abandonment become clear because of its status. Nevertheless, I shall try to include this forgotten funerary garden within the wider 18th century Ottoman era urban landscape by exploring some historic qualities whose cultural significance is relevant to both communities, observing how remnant artifacts connect not only to the people who once inhabited this area, but also to those living across the Mediterranean, I shall discuss the inscriptions on the tombstones, what they say, and who might have put them there. A conjectural recreation of the significance of ritual and commemoration in a particular moment in history will be examined. Finally, I hope that the interest for the site as artefact can help in its revival. Around 1759-1760, a ship bearing dignitaries from Egypt, perhaps on a stately visit, capsized in a storm off the coast of Limassol. The dignitaries who perished at sea were buried in this specially designated landscaped graveyard north of the harbour. There are 7 graves, 3 of which bear marble stelae, while the others have plainer sandstone details. The marble tombstones are further embellished. We can see them. Go back, look at them a little bit. The marble tombstones are further embellished with stylized flower symbols and dervish insignia, and they were published by Tuncer Baygiskan in 2009. Their calligraphically embossed verses are in a forgotten language, foreign to the island. They have never, apart from a brief time of joint Ottoman Limassolian and Mameluke Egyptian commemoration, spoken to the town's inhabitants or caretakers. This is the premise upon which my talk evolves, around everyday heritage. It unfolds through a series of assembled observations and conjectures. Fernand Braudel describes conjecture as a time which can frame several years during which large-scale social, economic, and political changes converge. A conjecture, therefore, does not involve just a period of time, but rather a hinge or a defining moment in history. By stringing important life-changing dates along a timeline between the 18th and 20th century, fleshed out with references about people of the time, we can observe pivotal interactions imprinted onto the city fabric. We can thus examine spatiality as a sensorial assemblage, not only as it is affected by official history, but also as we insert smaller everyday heritage experiences into the bigger picture, more intimate events emerge, which explain effects of agency onto the city space. In order to understand the context of this cemetery, however, we must first establish the context of ritual that was practiced within the city, making this forgotten cemetery credible. A look into Limassol's overlooked past evolves firstly along the defining feature of its relationship to water and how this has shaped the city layout. One assumes the influence of the sea, not only as a coastal edge, but more importantly in times past, as a broad expanse connecting the city through its harbour to opposite shores, bringing people, goods and influences from faraway lands while allowing people to integrate on opposite shores with other cultures. The sea has also determined the town's inhabitants, what they did, where they came from, what they brought. Both the town's engagement with the sea, but also the people who enacted this engagement, have left traces which still read today, not only in the layout, but in the configuration of agencies, some benign, others terrible. But we must also think back to the sea's terrorizing aspect when travelling in a storm in past centuries. The fear of waves, multiple shipwrecks, pirates, the worry for loved ones embarking upon perilous journeys, the prayers of relief offered on reaching solid dry land after days of being tossed upon the sea. Similarly, for local residents, the fear of flooding, both from the sea storms as well as from rivers that overflowed their banks, seen on the early Kitchener 1883 map. And you can see northwest of the town, this sort of spaghetti mixture of rivers flowing down, which have since vanished. During the 18th century, when the Mamelukes were Limassol's maritime neighbours, a mere 360 kilometres to the south, the town would have been linked more directly by sea to Alexandria and Cairo than to the island's hinterland, for which few roads existed. The sea possessed a dynamic surface, facilitating movement of myriads of diverse people across it on a daily basis, influencing cultural extensions over the wider Mediterranean and its surrounding ports, connecting coasts of the Middle East to Europe and Africa. Extant Ottoman era Urban artifacts identified in the city reveal relationships of people of different cultures and creeds together with their languages, customs, beliefs, and behavior, as they were brought together in life but also in death. At the time, Limassol was the southernmost town of the Ottoman realm. Briefly, it appears to have perhaps forged more significant informal influences with Egypt, which was geographically closer than the port.
Would you mind slowing down a little bit?
Oh, all right. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I had tend to speed up as I go along.
Oh, yeah, I know. What is this?
Right, I shall do. Okay. What would a traveller see as they arrived at the harbour in the 1750s? What is the first thing they would do upon disembarking? In the 1883 map of Limassol by Lord Kitchener, the town is depicted at the end of the Ottoman era and shortly after colonial takeover. These maps, however, also functioned as administrative tools with intended reconfigurations. Tracts of the city, therefore, that were to be altered are shown empty on the map or already altered. We thus have no mapped precedent where alterations occurred, particularly around the harbour, and you can see the pier already mapped on the harbour, but a lot of empty space around, which is quite unnatural based on pictures we have of that area of the time. The old harbour contains 4 clusters of Ottoman-era structures. One, the harbour landing, in red outlining its 19th century edge, with coffee shops, khans, markets, warehouses, of which the ruins are seen in the uncovered little piazza in the centre, and the castle, which is just off the image to the right. Shrines for immediate votive prayer exist upon leaving and entering the city by sea, dedicated to both religions, and we have a little Christian shrine in the top corner and the Muslim shrine in the bottom, to which I shall return. We also have Ottoman bathhouses seen as little orange circles in both ends of the city. I shall move here and up there, so we have both ends. A necessity for residents and travellers arriving after weeks at sea. Behind the harbour clusters are the wealthy townhouses dominating the skyline on its north periphery, outlined in orange. This is an incomplete map, it still needs a bit of more work. And an intricate irrigation system can also be observed in the 1929 maps, outlined in blue. We have the river. The light blue outline has shifted in the 1929 map from the original bed of the river, which is outlined with the black lines, so it's much wider. So we already see attempts at controlling the flow of water towards the sea. The town gradually developed along the east coast with harbour, commerce and landing piers in front along the shore, and with residents surrounding their main religious edifices behind. These, however, were either demolished or rebuilt during the colonial era. You can see Ayia Napa Church, brand new, in the back in 1917. Older piers can be seen resiliently surviving in the painting by Ismet Güney, allowing for disembarking of people and goods as well as providing recreation to the local population. The first thing I assume someone disembarking would do in past centuries would be to swiftly offer a prayer of deliverance at the shrine of the saint of their creed. To this effect, the harbour entrance is flanked ceremoniously by 2 such saints, a Christian and a Muslim, Ayia Fekla Church to the west of the harbour, and Pir Ali Dede Tekke to its east. More will be discussed in both these religious shrines. Today, both are wedged into surrounding buildings. The market and coffee shops lining the harbour entry were international trading hubs where traders and travellers mingled and where the cosmopolitan character of the town opened up local society to the world beyond the harbour. Coffee may have been one of the avant-garde beverages to have entered Limassol as early as the 17th century, based on recent finds uncovered in a controversial shipwreck within Cyprus territorial waters. Today, traces of the former coastal building foundations serve to recall their presence, as we have seen in the historic outlines, but we can flesh out history with oral records. We know of Mr. Akif Nouri, one such coffee shop proprietor and father to the brothers Ozai and Seljuk Akif, who wrote the brilliant memoir of Limassol titled Echoes from the Past. Mr. Akif Sr. was fluent in Greek, Turkish, French, and Arabic, and would serve coffees while simultaneously providing translations to his customers. The multiplicity of languages heard on the streets of Limassol in past centuries is revealed through the 1891 comedy play by Epaminondas P. Efthimiadis, O Pharmakopios και ο Choriatis, or The Apothecary and the Peasant. This play, which had been published but never performed, was uncovered in handwritten notes in an antiquary bookshop in Crete and was sent to Limassol, where it received its first premiere 125 years later in 2016. The writer of the play builds to comic tragic effect upon misunderstandings created by Limassolians speaking High Greek, Katharevousa, and Low Greek Cypriot, a smattering of French, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, and Ottoman Turkish, and, interestingly, the writer's own scant knowledge of English at the time. In the painting of the Severis collection by an unknown artist, it is assumed that the harbour depicted is that of Limassol when the Ottomans handed the island over to the British. Its inaccuracies, particularly on the right-hand side, may lead us to think that the artist did not disembark, but merely sailed past. Perhaps he completed the sketch based on fleeting observations or what someone else described to him. Note, however, the dense planting in the right background and the ruins of a round dome structure in the right forefront, to which we shall return. Perhaps with the fictitious minaret, the artist was trying to convey creed to this ambiguous ruined structure. The domed ruins are also mentioned in other travellers' notes, but no one has cared to uncover what exactly this building on the harbour might have been. This structure was probably ruined before the island's handover, as we shall see further. We assume that the formal public spaces discussed so far would have been predominantly occupied by men, but where were the women? Would they have been a visible or a concealed part of the population on the harbour periphery? Before discussing this, another quality of water determines the history of Limassol and also integrates the story of women in ritual. The always problematic torrential rainwater flowing towards the sea via the river with two names, Varilis in its sleepy, sludgy state, the brackish water, also a contaminant for eyes, judging by its Cypriot name, but also Lycos, the wolf, when it rages, sweeping everything in its path. Historical floods have left their mark on the city to this day. Local poet Vasilis Michailidis describes a Turkish Cypriot woman drowning by the weight of her gold jewellery as she was swept away. It is not surprising, therefore, that prominent members of society throughout the town's history undertook solutions against flooding. Bagiscan in 2003 mentions one such benefactor, the rich landowner Ali Haji Hassan Aga. He dedicated the shrine and fountain of Ayafetla in his orchard, which he built in his orchard between the river and the castle, and made it accessible to the public after his daughter's eyes were cured by the spring water. It would appear that Ali Haji Hassan Aga also drained the marshy river estuary, channeling surplus water into huge nearby water basins and canals, seen in sort of dark turquoise. The upgraded irrigation would have also served dereh hammam or eski hammam, the old baths, which was built by Egyptian craftsmen, seen with a little round circle there where the dome would have been in the bottom. Remains of the hammam are now housed in an ouzo factory. Legends about the Gila Virgin Saint say she was descended from early Christian Anconium in Italy, and her worship was brought to Limassol by settlers from Silifke or Selevkia in Turkey. During the saint's life, she was said to have miraculously healed the sick, but the male establishment of doctors wanted her killed, and when an assassin entered her house, she ran to the mountains, which opened, and she disappeared inside. While her martyrdom occurred in Seleucia in modern-day Iraq, according to Gunnis, Bagistan in 1987 claims she was martyred in Silifke, from where the Agar came to Limassol. It was also believed that whoever drank this water would see white pigeons flying and would gain their health. Ayya Thekla was celebrated by both Christians and Muslims of the town. Within the proximity of church and hammam, we can see cohabitation of Christian and Muslim water customs. The Ottoman inscription on the fountain in the bottom left, on the fountain's facade niche, dates the church and its underground spring to 1604. Unfortunately, contemporary misplaced religious contesting has covered over and defaced this inscription. Derek Hammam, for which we have no image save the name, was favored by young Turkish Cypriot brides for their wedding rituals, and such a bride is seen upper right. But both Ayya Thekla Church and the Hammam are unmarked on the 1883 and 1929 colonial maps. Hammams close to the harbour relied on a steady supply of channeled fresh water. They functioned on a rota of days of the week and times of the day to accommodate the needs of the population and visitors, both male and female, high and low class. A procession, therefore, of ladies, as some probably covered, walking in the streets, with their servants carrying bundles of towels and food, as they made their way to the hammam, would have been an ordinary sight of an informal ritual. Poor women would have made up part of the town's working force. They would have tended vegetable gardens and worked as peddlers, washerwomen, henna sellers, weavers, but they would have been socially invisible. Here we see Turkish Cypriot women working at a harbour onion packaging warehouse in the 1950s. It is unlikely that they would have changed much over the past centuries. Social status for other women was represented through their work. Khalfa Hanum, top right, worked as a bride dresser, and Meryem Abla, bottom right, was Limassol's midwife during early colonial times. The space, therefore, which catered to lower but also middle-class Muslim women's spiritual needs, takes over our story. Limassol possesses an important but overlooked vernacular architectural monument which is dedicated to the Muslim saint Pir Ali Dede. The small domed chamber housing the saint's now empty grave is situated on the east side of the harbour, across from the Christian chapel. Ali Dede was said to protect sailors, and it was believed he could walk on waves, holding a scepter in his hand. He was able to make himself visible to ordinary people, and was also said to have powers to calm the raging sea by waving his magic forked staff. If one were to pray to him before a sea voyage, the saint would wave his staff, calming the waves and ensuring safe passage, a transference perhaps borrowed from Poseidon's trident. The small square burial chamber, crowned with an elliptical dome or turbe, would have been part of an extensive tekke, an institution similar to a convent, which also provided legal court services to Muslim families of Limassol, according to Akif 2008. Like Ayya Thekla, the tekke, which was founded around 1572, is also unmarked on the Kitchener map, save for some indications of graves in those little dots there, despite the existence of the colonial title deed. A copy dated 1929 cites 2,002 square feet or 186 square meters for tekke and Muslim cemetery, but this would have been only a small part of a once extensive complex including many more buildings based on tekkes elsewhere, and given the size of the remaining plot of land surrounding which was also Eskaf and Port Authority property, and that empty spot is around 4,000 square meters of space. The inscription over the tomb doorway reads Hegira 1307 or 1889, probably a restoration date, while the graves in the back are dated to 1813. The burial chamber under the dome today contains a cenotaph seen on the right. The saint's remains and votive artifacts were transferred to Kyrenia Mosque after 1974, seen on the left. The dome is crowned with a copper, heavily oxidized dervish finial cap called the sikhe. A small gathering room in front survives with its prayer windows towards the street and a cemetery on the side, the hazire, containing graves with insignia of the Bektashi order. But in order to understand the importance of Pir Ali Dede Tekke, we need to understand who the dervishes were in early Ottoman society. Among the Turks, those who practiced Sufism, Islamic mysticism, were known as dervishes, a generic term for a wide range of philosophical dispositions and social roles. Some dervishes were wandering Sufis, but most subscribed to one of numerous brotherhoods known as tarikats, and they took part in the communal life of a tekke. The central figure of each tekke was the sheikh, who was the venerated teacher, accepted as a spiritual descendant of the pir, the saint who had first founded the tekke. The lower ranks in the dervish order were known as babas, dedes, chelebis, ashiks, followers of Ali, etc. The fact that many of these titles survive as surnames in the Greek Cypriot population of Cyprus discloses that the dervish orders were open to both communities. In Cyprus, we have indications of Sufi orders in all towns and many villages. The two most prominent belong to the Sunni sect, the Mevlevi with a tekke in Nicosia, and the Naqshbandi with tekkes in Timbul and Lefka. The tekke in Limassol would have belonged to the Shia Bektashi order, which was, however, brutally dissolved by the Sultan in the first half of the 19th century after their unsuccessful uprising. When the British arrived on the island in 1878, they avoided dealing with different creeds of the Muslim population. It is therefore curious that Ali Dede Tekke in Limassol, most of whose property was probably demolished in the mid-19th century, resiliently functioned until 1974. And another curiosity is that its last Sufi Hoja was a woman known as Sheikhinin or Sheikh Safiye Hanum. Until 1996 also, both Jami Kebir and the Tekke were looked after by Limassol's last surviving dervish, Miselujan Fatih, whom I met selling corn on the cob on Molos, and unfortunately I didn't think at the time of taking a picture of her. Back to literatures. But dervishes belong to a religious and cultural transformation of Islam with beliefs and customs going back to Central Asia, even before the Muslim religious foundation in the 7th century, and before a series of southwesterly migrations brought nomadic Turkic tribes into Anatolia more than 1,000 years ago. Since these tribes brought no literary tradition with them, they adopted the Arabic script, as had other Muslim converts of the time, such as Iranians and Persians, who possessed their own literary traditions. The political dynasty, which came about to be known as the Ottomans, initially appropriated literary culture from its neighbors, but also actively evolved their own literary traditions, which flourished well into the 19th century, and which came to an abrupt end under the controversial for some, revolutionary for others, leadership of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in the 1920s. With his rejection of the Arabic script and adoption of a Latin-based alphabet, Ottoman Turkish was converted to modern Turkish, which could also be written more phonetically, reflecting also Turkey's new awareness of its identity at the turn of last century, but also its breach with its multicultural past. Dervishes left behind a rich literary tradition which may have been destroyed or concealed in our part of the world, but they also left inscribed symbols on buildings and tombstones located throughout Cyprus and particularly in Limassol. We shall be looking at what these writings, silenced by the turning hinges of history, once spoke, both to the community surrounding them, but also to the neighboring ones from across the sea, where dervish customs continued to be practiced. Today, we are bombarded by images of Muslim fundamentalists, and the global repercussions of their activities fill our screens. But by observing the architectural remnants of a little studied building type, the demure and vernacular dervish tekke, and its ensemble of structures, a particular pious aspect of historic Ottoman Islamic society is revealed to us through its surviving layers of narratives. Through these buildings, a middle ground emerges between high Ottoman society and everyday history, which has left its resilient traces both on the ground but also through writings and images, prompting us to actively engage with the agency of their assemblage. Let us look at the composition of a tekke. The most prominent visual impact facing the street would have been its graveyard, surrounded with lush vegetation. Within the graveyard, there would be a turba burial chamber and a water fountain or sibyl. Landscape tekke cemeteries also contained graves of former sheikhs and other persons venerated by pilgrims who sought beneficence through prayers and offerings. There were rooms for permanent dervish residents and visitors, kitchens to also feed the city's poor, a library, a hospice, a school. Contemporary scholarship in Turkey has largely ignored these complexes, considering them to belong to a time of cultural decline. Fortunately, a revived interest revises these misconceptions, for tekkes were built not by the great and wealthy, but by devout ordinary people to serve for their own intimate spiritual and social needs. In modern terms, tekkes are the result of bourgeois or middle-class patronage. As such, they have rarely had a voice or a strong presence in Cypriot top-down national history. The tekke and its remnants thus become a mirror of social history. Tekkes offered prayer space and acted around the saint's tomb, but also provided a communal gathering space, often in a domed chamber. Physical manifestations of venerations included meditations and blessings, vigils, ritual dancing, philosophical discussions and greetings, particularly on the subject of love of the divine. There were also festive feasts and processions through the town with banners and music. The tekke's size, its architectural qualities, and its location, but also its spiritual possessions and relics, indicated its importance. Equally important were the sheikh's renown, expressed through his title of Pir, and his access to wealth through his connections, both local and overseas. The domed hall, such as this lavish one from the Mevlevi Tekke in Cairo, perhaps explains what the misdrawn ruin on the harbour front in the painting of the Severus collection might have once been. Dervish rituals are still practiced, such as this one, in Egypt. The medieval dervish institution encapsulates diverse and divergent Islamic theology, rituals of mysticism, Platonic philosophy, calligraphy, painting, music, poetry, sculpture, and architecture, and was surprisingly conductive well into the 19th to mid-20th century. Remains are seen to impact everyday details of life, such as food, in drinking wine, or ashure, a mixture of wheat, pomegranates, and almonds. Ashure commemorates Ali's demise, and the commemoration ritual is still practiced by some Turkish Cypriots. Clothing, poetry, beliefs all reveal a wealth of Ottoman-era urban life from the street to the home. Surviving materiality within Limassol clearly displays the stratigraphic levels at which this life was lived, both by male and female members of the community. Lifchus considers the study of the significance of dervish tekkes to be a salutary corrective to the familiar and often superficial, exclusive picture of the invading Ottoman military machine. During the early 20th century, Turkish Cypriot Limassolians remember that only women used the shrine of Ali Dede, since he was also the saint protecting women and children. Sheikh Safiye Hanum was licensed to read the Quran and conduct public prayer, and also to teach at the girls' school on Ankara Street. Her public oratory presence defies everything we seem to know about the practices of official Islam until we delve into dervish beliefs. In their teachings, Shia dervishes believed that at the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century, his rightful heir should have been his son-in-law Ali and his daughter Fatima. Ali's reign was short-lived, however, and he was defeated by the Sunni clergy within the same century. In this early belief, one can witness an emergent quality of men and women in Islamic tradition, which seems to have persisted in some dervish sects. Many other folk customs surround Ali Dedeteke, Turkish delight, citrus, rosewater, and arranged perfumed blossoms were offered to the female visitors, a custom still practiced by Turkish Cypriot women elsewhere. Ritual chanting included the reciting of the epic poem Mevlid-i Sharif, according to Akif, and after prayers, the believers would caress the ground at the tomb and walk in procession around it in 3 to 7 times, believing that the saint would grant their wishes. Also, women who gave birth to stillborn babies and were afraid that their next child could also die used to come to lay their baby on the tomb of Piri Dede. The mother would leave the shrine and walk away, while another woman would take the infant in an attempt to fool death. We can now return to the centrally located cemetery garden, the Hazire with the Mameluk tombstones of 1760, and examine clues to its dervish practice. For the burial of the Mameluk dignitaries, Ali Dedeteke's tradition of public rituals would have provided a framework for a commemorative ceremony beyond the one officiated by the formal Ottoman authorities. By the very nature of the tombstones and their calligraphic poems, but also dervish symbols, we shall trace some form of ritual procession unfolding through the city, in which presumably the town's dervishes would have played a role between Harbour Teke and Cemetery Garden. The cemetery is enclosed on 2 sides by the mosque, while narrow streets enclose the opposite sides. Flood damage in 1894 led to a reconfigured extension on the northwest wing rebuilt in 1906, over an older dome remnant, possibly the Frankish cathedral ruins. The extension, paid for by Efkat, was carried out by the Greek Cypriot stonemasons Nikolakis Kallas, specializing in minarets, and Neophytos Lanidis, alias Malapapas, who has signed his name on the bottom right, while the colonial architect William Williamson has signed on the left. The new mosque wing of 1906, with its eclectic architecture, characteristic of Mameluk striped masonry, but also women's mosques in the Ottoman realm, formalizes a ritual space for women in the early 20th century. Jami Kibir Cemetery, designated for the Egyptian dignitaries, was separate from other Muslim cemeteries of the town. Furthermore, when under colonial rule cemeteries were moved outside the town, this one remained. Originally, there would have been a central entry portal and a cross pathway defining a threshold with a central fountain. This cemetery is also unmarked on Kitchener's 1883 map. It would have been similar to a later one of 1821, which is mapped as a park further east. Planting would have created a vision of paradise seen from inside the mosque. Let us observe the grave of Rear Admiral Mehmed Beg. The headstone tells us that he is the son of High Admiral Suleiman Pasha, the Kaptani Derya. A frame separates the flowers from the tapering neck, which supports a pleated ribbed turban wound with a narrow double diagonal sash. 6 inscribed rows of verse are contained in rectangular frames. Set in a half-circle medallion, Hegira, 1173 or 1758, is inscribed in relief on the bottom row. The final verse, I assume you've read it, alludes to a garden of paradise. Above the epitaph, a symmetrically splayed bouquet of cut flowers with a central open lotus is flanked by drooping tulips on either side. The flowers are tied by a ribbon in a bow, their stalks elongating into the calligraphic script below. Cut flowers symbolize youth cut in its prime. The lotus and tulips convey that this was an important emissary with high-ranking links to respective Mameluk and Ottoman administrations. The footstone, rendered in relief carving in controlled artistic style and splendor, is separated into an entablature cap with stylized acanthus tendrils. To the uninitiated, a stalk of serrated acanthus rises in the center. To the initiated, this outlines a Sufi mode inscribing the name of Ali. It was also known as the Zulfikar, or Ali's serrated double sword. An anthropomorphic face in the panel below appears. The nose is shaped by the trunk of the vine, while coiled tendrils to either side outline the eyes. Two hanging bunches of grapes give substance to the cheeks. Sufis found a way to circumvent the ban on depicting faces through such stylized images. The vine also alludes to Sufi beliefs about the wine of love that Ali is supposed to have offered, cupping his hands to Muhammad to drink. This act symbolically placed Ali above the Prophet in dervish belief, according to Mirmiroglu in 1940. It is as if the tombstones speak of the deceased as a person who held two ranks, the formal displayed on the headstone, while important dervish affiliation and rank is shown in the footstone. On the grave of Sayyid Muhammad Effendi, a sippus, or an ancient Hellenistic Roman funeral marker, sits across from the headstone. The footstone here is a plain-pointed trapezoid devoid of decoration. A round, broad-sashed turban, possibly of the Qadiri Gül or Rose Sufi order, crowns the headstone as seen from above in the bottom right. The embossed verse in 6 straight rows, separated by plain horizontal bands, is framed inside plain cartouches, and a lower cartouche frames a date. The laconic somberness of the inscription is perhaps composed by colleagues paying their respects. Sayyid Muhammad was probably an older civil servant of high rank, and his passing, expressed as moving on, is in dervish tradition. I favor Mohammed Ababnek's translation of 2002, when he's a professor from the Department of Epigraphy at the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology at Yarmouk University in Jordan. And in September 2000, I met him by chance. I took him to the cemetery and he started reading of these stones. And then I realized that I had passed them 100 times, but I had never heard what they wrote, what they were written, was written on them. Hence the stones that whisper. It was a time before cell phones. I had an envelope in my back pocket and a stub of a pencil, and I jotted down his translations. Lastly, the grave of Mehmed Emin Bey contains most of the clues that address social history, erudition, but also indications of formal social connections which the ceremonial burials appear to convey. In the cemetery center, we are told, lies the son of Ömer Kaptan, with the particular echoes of a mother's lament in the prosopographical epitaph. The grave is adorned with a striking pair of tall white marble stelae, inferring the deceased's status. The headstone is crowned again by a turban of narrow wound ribbed pleats set upon a short tapering neck. Shallow relief decorates the front with calligraphic verse. And again, quoting Ababnek, I am the one whose rose sapling has withered away before it blossomed. I am the one who has departed, longing for his mother and sister's caresses, who remained in the foreign land. Mehmed Emin Bey, son of Ömer Kaptan, pray to his soul the Fatiha. Above the verse, floral and other insignia read from right to left. A proud dervish standard facing north, borne on a short staff crowned with a new moon. In the center is a tiered symmetrical motif of stylized jasmine flowers coiling out into a serrated frame. Here again is the outline of the Zulfikar, although drawn in a more folk tradition rather than the highly stylized Zulfikar in the previous stone. On the left is a flowering cut zümbül in Turkish, hyacinth in English, or yakinsos in Greek. The narrow footstone, capped with a pointed, rounded pyramid cap, sits over Makarna chamfered edges. The carvings here offer perhaps a more personal narrative to one affiliated to dervish practice, particularly since we are given to understand that this is a grave of a mere boy whose life was abruptly ended before he had a chance to excel. There is pride in his origins in the tall dervish standard, pointing south to his homeland perhaps. A fresh blossoming rose front twines around the standard shaft, spilling blooms, buds, and leaves down both sides. The fresh roses, not drooping, underline his youthfulness and untimely loss. Youthful loss of life is depicted on the bottom left by the cut stalk, which has been transplanted into a shallow bowl. It reads as a plea to the local community, perhaps from the mother, to tend his grave as if it were their own, by evoking domesticity through the cross-pleated carpet on the balcony surrounded by a low balustrade. The verse implores the local community to keep the boy's memory alive, but mention of siblings is there to not forget social obligations towards the other children who are mentioned. Perhaps women behind the once latticed windows of the mosque would have looked out onto the ritual, listening and reciting poetry of lament and celebration. The prominence of society of Muslim women in Limassol has to be taken into consideration based on the fact that mothers and sisters of the deceased are acknowledged in the verses which publicly address both congregation and onlookers. It is possible that Ali Dede, by reason of its patronage of women and children, would have facilitated the mother from Egypt in commemorating this young boy. Pictures taken in 2019, however, show the dire state of the artifacts. Herbicide and lack of water have also killed the garden. While the other inscriptions speak of a more formal and erudite selection of verses and symbols, whether by colleagues or Sufi affiliates, it appears that someone intimate, perhaps assisting the mother of Mehmed Emin Bey, would have had a part in the narrative's informal composition. It is still doubt so that this boy does not appear wanting beside the other distinguished burials. We can imagine the mother preparing, selecting the marble in a workshop in Alexandria or Cairo, poring over the craftsman's catalogue of insignia, choosing with careful deliberation. No expense appears to have been spared. Although foreign to Limassol, the intimate details nevertheless appear to address a familiar society. Formally, the young nobleman's aspirations and social status are displayed on the headstone. He is the standard bearer. The smaller flag on the headstone shows the direction he went to, pointing north. The Zulfikar sword of Ali denotes his fervent dervish affiliation. The Zulfikar would have been a familiar symbol to initiated Sufi Greeks and Turks of the time, as I have found referenced in memoirs of Stavrianos from Lofu, who went to fight in the War of Independence of 1821. Another interesting feature is the stylized five-petaled rose on the tombstone. This might have been the late 16th century yellow Rosa foetida, also known as the Persian rose, imported to Europe in the 16th century, since Europe had no yellow roses before that. The similarity of the stellar composition, as seen in the illuminated Flemish manuscript by Horace Hofnagel of 1562, serves to show that erudite Mamelukes would have possessed or would have possibly been familiar with or even possessed such priceless European illustrations. Through the artistry of the stone carvings, they wanted to project their affluence, education, and trade connections between the East and Europe. Flowers since medieval times were used to convey cryptic messages, particularly by upper-class ladies through their embroidery. In this Flemish illustration, the pink eglantine rose is eruditely contrasted to the yellow rosa foetida. Hofnagel's composition is also crowned above with a hyacinth, a flower found originally in the Balkans and the Middle Eastern gardens, but also cultivated in Holland. The depiction of a hyacinth on the Mameluk headstone speaks through the flower's Greek name, Yakinthos, perhaps in an acknowledgement of the town's Greek population. In Greek mythology, the beautiful youth named Yakinthos was adored by the god Apollo. Because of this, he was killed by the jealous Zephyros, god of west winds and early summer breezes. Yakinthos was a pre-Hellenic god, but eventually assimilated into Apollo's cult. Certain aspects of this cult suggest that he was an underworld deity whose death was mourned like that of Adonis. Whoever assembled the floral decorations shows that they were well read in both European scientific manuscripts as well as regional mythology. However, all these tightly packed literary allusions would have been obvious only to a very small close circle of initiated members, such as the erudite Platonic cult within dervish circles. For this, I finally and briefly turn to Plato's Symposium and critical readings as discussed by Fanny Söderbäck. Might Plato offer useful tools that challenge and resist contemporary political discourse, defined by simplistic binary thinking? And through Plato's rereading, can he provide resources for thinking about, for instance here, such a space in terms that transcend simple dichotomies between here and there, inside and outside, us and them? Plato's Symposium, perhaps, can help us imagine the commemoration ritual enacted between the Harbour Teke and the Mameluk graves. In the 1760s, the bereaved guests would have arrived at the harbour landing, where they would have been surely greeted by the town's dervishes, and the procession would have led through the city, pausing on the enclosed cemetery's threshold. As in the Symposium, women would have been probably left outside. In the Mameluk garden, the voices of the young nobleman's mothers participate through the composed verses. In Plato's Symposium, Diotima speaks through Socrates to recount the many kinds of love that exist, that she has taught and he has learned. The dervish ritual in Limassol would have evolved around poetry and reciting in the best Sufi tradition. The presence of women attending the ritual is witnessed on the periphery, formalized in later centuries by the mosque extension. It both shields but also signifies erudite women's presence. The calligraphic tombstones in Limassol are, in the mid-18th century, an avant-garde funerary embellishment which went on to become mainstream in Ottoman cemeteries in Turkey during the following century. Through their art, these carvings provide us with a window into a past where we can observe tactile contact between Mediterranean coastal cultures long before British colonial administration. The Mameluke seafaring erudite society was instrumental in transferring novel European influences to Limassol. The town's equally seafaring cosmopolitan society took in the bereaved, but also became an early intermediary for this funerary cultural innovation, providing a route of transference to the Ottoman mainland. The ritual was exclusive for a select audience. Delicate allusions evoke European influences, Eastern mysticism, and cosmopolitan erudition. The commemoration ritual is directed at a familiar audience, the local Ottoman, but also dervish society, when it was a respected institution. The local community would have equally scrutinized the important symbols and their meanings that forged shared bonds with those from across the sea during a brief few decades of peace which reigned between the two cultures. By its nature of ritual, spatial exclusion, this Platonic community was condemned to a precarious existence and inevitable disappearance in an evolving, multifaceted, non-homogeneous society that has been continuously challenged by shifts in power and politics. A new, more inclusive way is therefore needed to imagine how this space and the stories it tells could once again become meaningful. By taking a giant step with one foot in the past and one in the future, I believe it would be wonderful if the funerary gardens of Limassol were to be restored through an act of both administrative care and inclusivity, celebrating the city's varied multicultural past that continues to inform the town's present. In the words of Professor Boras, each culture which passes through our lands graces our cities with precious artifacts, which they have left behind for us. We should honor them by becoming their keepers. Thank you for your attention. I would just like to acknowledge people of Limassol from both communities for providing the oral stories, particularly Mr. Seljuk and Mr. Ozai Akif, who are tonight in Limassol giving a tour of the old town, and Mrs. Artemis Yordamli, who provided the framework of our collaboration in 2002 with the Turkish Cypriot project, and also to Mr. Tuncer Bagiskan, who has always nurtured a shared passion for Cypriot invisible stories. And lastly, to my own dede, my grandfather, who told us stories about dervishes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serena. Now, this lady, although she's Cypriot, forgot that most Cypriots are late. They're always late. 7 o'clock done, she started the lecture. So I never had a chance to introduce her. To introduce an architect and a practicing innovative cultural heritage researcher with a historic preservation degree at the National Monuments of Culture from Sofia University. She's also a Fulbright scholar from Cornell University. Serena has published research on how the island's two main cultures, Greek and Turkish, come together through mapping temporal divisions in Nicosia, in the Journal of Mediterranean Studies in 1998, water irrigation sharing with Glasgow University Oxford Books in 2013, coming together in Mutalos with Routledge in 2019, Modernity, Conflict and Resilience in Nicosia's Ottoman Parts with Saki Press in 2019. Between 2014 and 2017, she was adjunct lecturer at Nicosia University on Cultural Heritage. Her historic research also involved contemporary architectural works, such as the Oroklini coastal walkway, the olive grove, the landscape.
Together with Margarita Lam.
Okay. The olive grove and landscape configuration used for classical music performances, restoration of the Kulunari late 19th, early 20th century mansion in Limassol, and the restoration and conversion of mud brick warehouses into Limassol Municipality Arts Center. The Apothekis is known as the Apothekis Papadaki. She has also worked on UNDP bicommunal archaeological conservation assignments and on ongoing research on history and resilience of water in the landscape with the Lana Foundation. Now, I just said it very, very quickly because she never gave me a chance at the beginning, but please, if you do have any questions, I'm sure she's ready to answer them.
Okay.
Now, questions. Well, people are embarrassed. Maybe we can ask her things over a cup of wine, which you're all invited to have outside. Thank you for being here tonight.
Ξέρω, λαλό ήταν πολύ, να ξέρω... Ναι, λαλό, αφού είναι ήρθες,